Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining this important AFSP Town Hall, the first in a town hall series on mental health and suicide prevention in minority communities. Today, we're focusing on mental health in the Black community. The panelists and I want to create a safe space to come together, to be vulnerable and honest, and to create supportive community. You know, in the midst of this historical moment of uprising for social justice with the Black Lives Matter movement and during a global pandemic, there is no time like the present to be together in solidarity and to be encouraging one another about our own mental health. COVID and recent events have laid bare the health, social, and economic disparities, leading to disproportionate trauma, suffering, and loss of life for people of color. In spite of these tragedies, as is the case throughout history, we're also witnessing enormous fortitude and strength among communities of color. So we at AFSP embrace the need for all of us to come together to address these inequities. At AFSP, we are listening and learning. The mental health field as a whole, we have to come clean. We have not, as a field, incorporated a true understanding of the daily experiences of discrimination for people of color and how that impacts mental health. As a field, we have not systematically incorporated that level of understanding into the research, the development of treatments, or our clinical care systems. And we at AFSP are realizing, as hopefully many organizations are in this moment, that even as empathic as we are in suicide prevention, in our work, we see the value and inherently believe in the value of all human beings, but that does not necessarily translate into an inclusive culture without intentional effort. So we all must apply that effort and energy and systematically and sustained to uproot the layers of systematic racial inequities that American society was built upon. At AFSP, we are still learning. We have convened 2 diversity task forces to learn from and expand our own culture of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And these task forces are helping us to ensure that our programs and our work at the chapter and local levels are as culturally inclusive as possible. Additionally, I'm very excited to announce that our scientific council very recently decided to make diversity a new priority area of our research grants program. As the leading private funder of suicide research, this is an important step that we are taking. We're also actively partnering with other organizations and experts in this space, including today's esteemed panelists who serve on AFSP's Diversity Task Force, in order to elevate this dialogue as a national priority. So today we have an opportunity to shed light on what drives mental health disparities, discuss how we can work together to elevate the dialogue, and ideally eventually solve these systemic problems. We will also be discussing very practical things like the role any of us can take in deepening mental health literacy for and among people of color. We will spend the first part of this session hearing from our panel of experts in a dialogue, and then I will open it up and welcome you, the participants, your comments and questions. So please submit any questions and comments you have online anytime during this hour, and we will try to get to them, as many of them as possible. So at this point, it is my pleasure to welcome our esteemed panelists in and have them introduce themselves. So I would love to go ahead and have Tandra, Ariel, and Vic introduce themselves, and we'll start with Tandra. And if you care to, and if you're comfortable, to go ahead and share a little bit about what brought you to the work of mental health and suicide prevention.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon for this very important town hall conversation. My name is Tandra Rutledge. I am the Director of Business Development at River Edge Hospital, and I also serve on the Board of Directors for the Illinois chapter for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. My connection to mental health and suicide prevention really goes back a long way. It stems from my experiences growing up in my community, in the Black community, and it stems from seeing within my community and my family and my church, people who were dealing with mental health conditions and issues, that they weren't addressing those issues, didn't recognize that these were treatable health conditions. And so very early in my life, I really made it my goal to give voice to those experiences, both personally and professionally. And so I've really dedicated my life to doing so. And I feel it a great privilege to be able to do so, to elevate the voices of people who may not use their voice. They have voices, but their voices go unheard. I'm also, another thing that, you know, connects me to this issue of mental health and suicide prevention is that I'm a mother of a son who has a diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So thank you, Christine, and I will now turn it over to Ariel.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ariel, and I am in Columbus, Ohio now, but born and raised in Springfield, Massachusetts. So in terms of mental health and suicide prevention, it's always been something that's been very near and dear to my heart. When I was younger, I actually lost my mother to breast cancer, and my mom was my all. She raised myself and my brother, and to actually experience that was very, very heavy, as you can imagine, as a 14-year-old, trying to come into adolescence and figure out what life is all about, but also having that loss. And I struggled myself with my own mental health. So being depressed, having thoughts about hurting myself. And I realized in the end that I was meant for more than that. And I was really, really encouraged to actually seek out help. I had a really good support network around me. My family helped me get through that really hard time in my life. And I was able to get over the hump, so to speak, and dedicate my life to actually helping others that not only experience loss, but also have those thoughts, because honestly, they're a lot more normal than we think they are. So I am very, very honored to be here, and I'm hopeful that this town hall will give you all some insight that you can use in your own lives.
Thank you. Vic?
Hi, I'm Vic Armstrong, and I am Director of the North Carolina Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services. And I am truly honored to be here with you to both share with the audience and also to have dialogue with this esteemed panel. You know, in talking about what brought me to this place, the reasons that I got into behavioral health and behavioral health advocacy are different in some ways from the reasons that I stay in this work and the reasons that brought me to suicide awareness. I think I got into the work of into the behavioral health field really because of a fascination with this human psychopathology and what makes people think the way that they do and why we respond to things the way that we do. But what really became a passion for me and what keeps me in this field is really the social justice piece of it. I do a lot of work around working with historically marginalized populations. And one of the things that I often share with people is that behavioral health and the behavioral health community is a historically marginalized population. It has always been an under-resourced area. It has been an area that has faced discrimination, oftentimes just because of having a mental health diagnosis. And so that's where I got the passion to really stay in and advocate. The suicide awareness piece came for me a little bit later because I worked for almost the last decade of my life with hospital systems. And one of the things that is key and primary to working in healthcare, whether it's mental health care or physical health care, is avoiding preventable deaths. And suicide is a preventable death. So that's what really kind of piqued my interest in it. And then the more that I learned about suicide prevention and suicide awareness, the more I began to reflect on the way that I was brought up, the things that I was taught, and the impact of suicide on communities of color, and specifically the African-American community, and realizing how much we don't know in the African-American community about the impact of suicide, and how much the rest of the world outside the African-American community doesn't know about the African-American community and how we think about suicide and how we think about mental health in general. So that has become a passion of mine, advocating for people who look like me, and advocating for people who don't look like me, but just realizing and recognizing that there is a social justice piece to this, and we all need to be advocating and speaking out about it.
Thank you all so much. Just your introductions alone, I think everyone can already see why we've convened this group. I want to get right into it and maybe start with just an honest moment of acknowledging where are we ourselves emotionally? How has this period of time been? And Tandra, I've heard you speaking out very recently, speaking very honestly about it's okay not to be okay all the time. And I wondered if you might share a little bit about that and if we can start there.
Yeah, I'll tell you that this has been very hard for me. I haven't been okay, like you mentioned. There have been times when I have had problems sleeping. I find myself being a bit more anxious about things. Not eating has been a big thing. It's really bad when you come home from work and your children say, "Mommy, did you eat today?" And you go, "No, I didn't." Um, and I've been very tearful and just really struggling. And one of the things I decided to do is to role model that, not only for myself, because I find that when you acknowledge and validate those feelings and experiences, there's power in that. There's power in that for healing, and there's power in that for other people. And so, what I've been very intentional about is saying, if I am not having a good day, I say, "Hey, I am not okay. I'm working on it. Thanks for asking." Or I say to people, "Today is not a good day." And I've given myself grace to have good days and bad days. And I think that has really helped me to allow myself to experience my anger, my frustration, my sadness, as well as experience joy and hope and happiness. And so just knowing that it's okay for me to feel what I'm feeling is so very important, and that there's nothing wrong with what I'm feeling. My responses are normal reactions to very abnormal events. We're talking about social justice issues. We're talking about mental health. We're talking about a pandemic. We're talking about all these layers and layers of things that really place a lot of stress on how we function. And, our mental health is really important, but it has to do with how we deal with these things, right? How we cope with stress, how we function in our day-to-day activities. And so our feelings, we have them, experience them, acknowledge them, own them, and speak on them. And so that's kind of where I am. Today is a good day. Today is a good day.
Thank you. I mean, you're really talking about so many things. We all, as human beings, have our mental health to manage, right? Just like we all have physical health, whether we have health conditions or not, we all have that. And in this moment, we worry a lot about kind of the layered trauma on top of deep, deep wounds and how the current events may open up some of those wounds. And what I'm hearing you say is that through your honesty with yourself and others, that it's allowing you maybe to process that experience. And our hashtag Real Convo campaign is about being more authentic with how we're doing. Vic, I know you speak out a lot about hashtag Real Convo. What are you seeing? What are you experiencing?
Yeah, it's been a really difficult time. I think for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, I will tell you that being a black man in America is difficult, and it's difficult for a number of different reasons. And I think the things that we're seeing play out, both with the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color, and then the things we're seeing play out with the death of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. All those things I think we internalize. And, for me, and I shared this a while back on social media, that for me, every time I see the senseless death of another black man, I feel like I lose a piece of myself. There's a piece of my humanity that I'm not sure that I can get back. And you fear that sometimes you're going to run out and not have enough to give. And I say that knowing that I consider myself to be very strong, strong physically, strong emotionally, strong mentally, strong spiritually. And if I hurt, then how much are other people hurting? So one of the things that I try to do to cope, in addition to physical exercise, is that I find it therapeutic to try to put something good out into the world. And sometimes good is just opening up the lines of communication and getting people to talk about things that are difficult to them. But I think good is also trying to put out messages of hope, trying to put out messages that inspire people. I find that for me, writing helps me. Sometimes I will write things down that I'm feeling internally because I was also socialized as an African-American male that, we're often socialized that the way you survive and navigate society is you be quiet and keep your head down. And so for a lot of African-American men, I think that, that impedes our ability oftentimes to talk about the things that we're feeling. We're taught to be strong. We're taught, you survived, your ancestors survived slavery. You can survive anything. When the reality is what they survived doesn't help me today. It doesn't make me stronger. It means that they were strong, but I'm having to deal with this, and I'm having to raise Black boys who are also going to have to deal with this. So I internalize a lot of things for them as well. But I do find that right now, what's giving me a lot of encouragement, a lot of hope, is having conversations with people who don't look like me and making connections with people who don't look like me, because that reassures me that there's good in the world, that there are people who do want all of us to get along, there are people who do want all of us to live harmoniously. And then also, sharing encouragement with people who are struggling, whether it's struggling with systemic racism or struggling with mental health challenges, trying to share with them, share my strength with them, and let them know that they're not alone. So that's a lot of what I do that helps me to not internalize things and to keep moving forward and being positive.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Vic. That really just hit on so many different things about the experience, but also some of the ways that you found helpful to cope. One of the things that I wanted to bring out and ask you all about are to help people understand why it is, what are the barriers. You mentioned some of them in terms of being socialized as a Black male, but are there other barriers? We've talked about the daily experiences of trauma, and if the world's not a safe place and the health system hasn't been a place where you can always get your needs met, those are significant barriers. But what else are you all seeing? Ariel, maybe I'll turn to you, and others please chime in.
Yeah, so in terms of mental health care utilization, let's talk about that specifically. So when we look at the data, we know that when you look at who's using those services and who's not using those services, there is a discrepancy, a huge discrepancy. So individuals of color are less likely to actually seek out or even be able to afford mental health services. And because of that, they don't actually go and get the help that they may potentially need. Unfortunately, our white counterparts are more likely to actually seek out services and be able to afford services as well for themselves or for their children. So we know that that is one of the areas where racial disparity is present. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that there's not a lot of folks in the mental health world or the behavioral health world that look like us, to be quite honest. I think that we as a people are more comfortable with people that look like us. And I feel as if when you're trying to explain a problem that you're facing or explain where you're coming from, it's a little bit easier to do that just in general with someone that's experienced that problem or experienced that situation. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of people that look like us in the behavioral health field. And that causes a even bigger gap to actually occur. So I would say that's one of the things I can think of off the top of my head when it comes to a racial disparity that could potentially be affecting why we are seeing some of these increases in mental health concerns for people of color.
I'd like to jump in if that's okay, because
Yes,
I
please.
I love what you said, and I want to go back to also what Vic said. Um, I think one of the things that I've experienced is that we have grown up, and I'll say, Black Americans, many Black Americans have grown up just dealing with and adapting to, either in healthy ways or unhealthy ways, these experiences of racism and discrimination. This is, we're talking about generational trauma. We're taught we're socialized, like Vic said, right? We're socialized how to navigate this world that doesn't see us or value us. And I think that one of the things I've noticed in feedback when talking to in communities of color is that the stress that we feel, it's just the stress of life, right? It's almost like it's normalized, right? And so we don't realize that it's problematic. We don't realize the impact that it could have because it's been our experience. It is just what we go through. So feeling like we have to carry the whole world and the weight of the whole world, as Black women, crying over, the deaths of Black women, Black men, and trying to protect our children. It's just what we do every day. We experience that. And so that's hard. So now we're trying to have conversations with people, and we're saying, your mental health, and we're like, what? This is just how I exist. This is just how I live. I got to go to work. I got to take care of my family. I don't have time to stop and consider my feelings and my thoughts because I have to survive. And we see that survival mode modeled. And Vic was talking about raising his sons, and you have to really be intentional, just like we're talking about issues of social justice and racism. You have to, be anti-racist. You have to be intentional. I think we have to, as Black Americans, we have to be intentional, right, about identifying and looking at our mental health and understanding what it is and calling it out. And I think that is really hard to do because the trauma of our experiences, that emotional and psychological trauma is so deep. I shared with several people that, and I know this is familiar, people, when they talk about trauma, they talk about a physical wound. And so I've been using that analogy, and I've said to people, it's like I have a wound that's open, that for years and most of my life, I just put a Band-Aid on it. I touch it every now and then. I know it's there. Something bumps into it and I go, ouch, right? And so now I feel like, because of what's going on in our world and in our country, that Band-Aid's been ripped off. And everybody's standing around just looking at the oozing scar, and no one knows what to do or how to render first aid. And so that, for me, is a way that I have tried to put into words what I'm feeling in those experiences that many people like me have.
Yeah, and I think both Tandra and Ariel have touched on some really important things, because I think the way that we're socialized to navigate the world, the rest of the world is also socialized in how they navigate us. And I think a lot of that lends to implicit bias in the way that behavioral health treatment is designed. I think from the beginning, looking at the fact that most of the treatment models that we use were created by white men, and most of them were created during a time when women and people of color were thought of as lesser. So they weren't designed with the nuances of what it feels like to be a Black person in America. So I think that's one of the challenges, and not having people who understand that culture, not having enough people like that in the field. When you think that, something like 2% of psychiatrists are Black, 2% of psychologists, 4% of social workers, there are not a lot of people who look like me who are in this field. And when you think about a Black man, having to go into an office and sit on the couch of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, 20-something-year-old white female and tell her, I don't feel like getting out of bed in the morning. I cry all the time and my sex drive is low. That's not a conversation that he's going to want to have with someone who he feels like can't relate not only to the symptoms he's feeling, but what it means to be a Black man and to feel powerless and to feel weak. That's something that we have to internalize. And the other thing I'll say about it is, and this is kind of where I think some of the implicit bias plays in, is that so much of it, I think, is how you hear people. And sometimes I'm not sure that in treatment, whether psychiatrists, psychologists, or social workers, whether they can hear sometimes the pain that's being expressed by people of color. You know, I look at, if you look at the diagnosis, the DSM diagnosis for paranoid personality disorder, and, you know, I don't have it in front of me, but there's something like 8 criteria, you got to hit 4 of them. And the 4 of them are things like, you know, you think that people are plotting against you. I mean, I'm paraphrasing this, or you think that, you know, you take things too seriously that people are saying that you shouldn't, or you think there's some kind of conspiracy against you. You get angry about things that you shouldn't get angry about. And depending on your perspective, you see that differently. Because I guarantee you that if you caught me on the right day and I told you about my day, I would probably hit 4 of those criteria. Mm-hmm. But what I'm explaining to you is a day in the life of a Black man in America. And if you don't hear that, if you only hear it from the lens of your diagnosis, then you're going to misdiagnose me, which happens to particularly Black men all the time. Black men are much more likely to be diagnosed as antisocial or schizophrenic. So part of the challenge for us too is trusting a system that misdiagnoses us. And then the final thing I'll say about that is one of the challenges for people of color as it relates to behavioral health treatment is the way that we enter the system. Mm-hmm. There aren't resources in our communities. So for a lot of people of color, their introduction to the behavioral health system is either in the back of a police car, mm-hmm. or it's in an acute care emergency department, neither of which are conducive to good outcomes, and neither of which are gonna make me feel like I wanna come back for treatment. And so there's no wonder that it's hard for us to get engaged in treatment and stay in treatment.
You know, I totally agree. This is great. A great conversation. And I was thinking while you were talking, Vic, about, you know, if we know that racism and bias impact mental health, why don't we screen for it? Mm-hmm. Why don't we ask people when they come in for treatment, has racism or discrimination impacted your ability to function? And hear from their voices. We know it's been, you know, the research shows that these experiences, you know, impact mental health. So we don't even screen for it, you know, as a healthcare system. We don't ask those questions. And so what Vic is describing, you know, sitting in there talking about, you know, what he's going through as experiencing a Black man, you know, being a Black man is true. You're not going to understand because you don't even have the data, like even right. in your assessment, mm-hmm. to in your own words, you telling the person that this is your experience. And it's not much different with Black women either. You know, the misdiagnosis and the mischaracterization of our emotions and our feelings, mm-hmm. and, you know, the whole, you know, stereotype of the angry Black woman and trying to like settle her down. Well, you know what? I do have a right to be angry, and anger is legitimate, and it anchors me in this world that, you know, is very unpredictable and cruel. And so anger is a part of healing. And so for many, many times, Black people and Black children, you talked about, you know, the misdiagnosis that hits me really home personally, you know, and advocating for my son, because we all know that Black boys are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. And so no matter where I go and do trainings and talk about mental health, that issue comes up. Mm-hmm. And I have had to advocate within my own systems with schools and people who are, because of bias or what have you, are not seeing my child and his condition for what it is. And I've had to say things like, no, I reject that. That is not, and you will not use that word to refer to my son because he is not that. You know, I've had to do that to protect him in this system that, you know, doesn't see or hear his value.
Let me just jump in, because what you all are bringing to life, I think, is so critically important. It's essentially the experiences of and breaking down. We use the term health disparities all the time, but it's such a sort of abstract term, and I think you're making it real for us and for the viewers. You know, I just want to add a little piece of data to make it even more concrete beyond just the mental health arena, that when a Black person goes in to see a primary care doctor, and let's say they have undiagnosed heart disease, they are far less likely to have that heart disease recognized, diagnosed, and treated than their white patient counterpart. And the same outcomes have been measured and found to be true for diabetes, kidney disease, pregnancy-related health issues, and pediatric care. And so we are talking about serious problems that need to be rectified. And I want to say the Institute of Medicine, now called the National Academy of Medicine, National Academy of Sciences, had a landmark report that assessed all of this and found those same outcomes in 2002. And here we are today. So let us hope and pray that this is the time of reckoning and the turning point where we can help educate all involved. These are health system leadership, clinicians. I mean, it has to be a very deep, as I mentioned in my introduction, uprooting of the sort of invisible layer of bias and racism that is at play, that is causing different outcomes, negative outcomes for people of color. So,
you know, if I could add one thing to that, you know, the other thing I think that to me is unacceptable is we know there are not enough people of color in the field. And to me, if we know this, and not just in mental health care, in healthcare in general, and if we know this, then why aren't we doing something to change that? And, you know, when I hear folks talk about, you know, how there's so few people going into the field, people of color, and we have so few now. You know, one of the analogies I always come back to is if I went to Clemson today or the University of Alabama today, they can tell me now who's in the 8th grade that's going to be playing football for them 4 years from now. Mm-hmm. They can do that for sports. Why can't we figure out in the behavioral health field how to go into communities of color and find young people who have an interest and have a propensity to be in the medical field, in the behavioral health field, and start to nurture them and mentor them and usher in the next group of clinicians, so that when we need someone who's culturally competent in navigating the Latinx community, we're not just talking about teaching a white person to speak Spanish and send them into the Latinx community. And that's incumbent upon us to make those changes.
Yes, and health system leaders, medical school leaders, graduate program leadership. And I will just say that I directed a program at UCSD for 10 plus years that looked for those candidates who weren't getting into medical school, but who were diamonds in the rough. And because of differences in opportunity, educationally and otherwise, but we could see that they had it. They had what it would take. We would invite them into this conditional acceptance post-bac program that was funded by an endowment but from the NIH. So the NIH does get behind these initiatives, but you've got to have the person power who will drive it at local institutions. And maybe we can even do better, you know, at a national level. It's a huge, huge issue of workforce, pipeline, as well as distribution.
And I know at Ohio State, they do have some programs that are geared towards undergraduates and also high school students that are interested in actually going into the medical field specifically. One program I know is called Aspire. And then also when I was in undergrad at Penn State, I was a part of the Ronald E. McNair program, which, yeah. So I am of that program.
Scholars.
Yes. So I am so thankful.
Getting out of hand.
Yes, but it was a great program. It was a great program. And it actually really did prepare me to apply for graduate school and to give me that experience where I don't think I would have taken graduate school as seriously, honestly, if I didn't have gone through the McNair program. And don't get me wrong, it was hard. It was so hard. And, but it was worth every single minute. And those, those friendships that I have from that program are pretty much unbreakable. And there's other opportunities that do present themselves. It's just hard to find them, to be quite honest. It's really hard to find them. Someone has to know about it, and then you have to be in their office at the right time, and then they just think about it. Where I wish there was like a repository of some sorts where, people of color that are interested in the field that want to actually pursue these programs and get ahead, so to speak, and get some experience under their belts could actually go to and really say, yep, I'm going to apply to this one and that one and see what happens.
I'll just mention something else that I had highlighted at the beginning, that AFSP is making diversity a priority area of our research grants program, means that we will be looking for those opportunities, not only where the topical area of study is about underrepresented populations and suicide risk and prevention, but where the individual researcher, him or herself, comes from an underrepresented background. And we do have plans to go to the historically Black colleges and universities and things like that to try to just help augment the pipeline. We're very interested in mentorship and those kinds of things. Let's talk about the appetite for this topic of dealing with stress, mental health, whatever the terminology is. What's going on in Black communities? What is the role of the church? Where can we do better and sync things up? How do you all see that?
So, I'll tell you, a lot of the work that I do in the, particularly African-American community is with the church. I grew up the son of a pastor. My father pastored for 48 years. So I grew up a preacher's kid. But in all the years my father pastored, I never heard either my father or any of his peers talk about mental health from the pulpit. So I think that's one of the challenges in the African-American community, is that the faith-based community has always been the gateway into the community. It's where we've been socialized. It's where, we've advocated through the church. And so I do think there's a role for the church to play in raising awareness about mental health. And I think there's also a responsibility for those outside the African-American community to recognize that the faith-based community, that the community centers, that there are entry roads into the African-American community that we need to connect with. And I often said, when I was working for a hospital system, we were being pretty intentional about integrating behavioral health into primary care and primary care into behavioral health, but we were not as intentional about integrating behavioral health into the community, into the church, into the YMCA, into the community center, into places where people feel comfortable. Because even with telepsychiatry, which we're seeing such a huge use of now, even in a non-COVID environment, a person is much more likely to go to their church and sit in front of a computer and talk to a psychiatrist than they are to go into a psychiatrist's office, because they don't have that same level of comfort, and they don't feel like they're in their own space. So I think those are things that we've got to do a better job of focusing on. But I think there's a two-way street. I think for the community, we've also got to invite behavioral health professionals into our church settings, and because the church has also been the voice that has let the rest of the world know what is important to the African-American community. And so I think there's a place for the faith-based community to let the rest of the world know that mental health is important to us.
As a Christian and someone who's involved in ministry for many years, this is very near and dear. And everything that Vic said is true. What I've experienced also is that when I started talking about mental health, people were listening and wanting more. So you talked about the appetite. Black people want to be just as healthy, want to save their family members and loved ones, They don't want to survive. We want to thrive like everybody else. So the appetite is there, right? And when we start talking about it, that's having that real convo. If I'm, comfortable talking about mental health, then it starts to open people up, even within the church. And so there's a very strong appetite for knowing what can we do, because we know that we're not okay. We know that we're not okay. We want the information. When I do programs on suicide prevention in communities, people are very interested in the statistics, the protective and risk factors and warning signs, but ultimately they want tangible acts. What do I say, right? And where do I take them? Who do I call? And so I think that there is a thirst, for the information. How we deliver it, though, is key. I shared with Christine probably about a year ago, was it, Christine?
So
At the advocacy forum, that as many years as I've been doing suicide prevention education, never fails when I am in a Black community doing it, whether I'm in a church or in a community center. What I've come to realize is that I can I can go through the program and I can go through all the information. And if I do not ask people, what are your thoughts, beliefs about mental health? What are your beliefs about mental illness? What are your beliefs about medication used to treat mental illnesses? And I literally have to have that conversation before I can do, a program, because that will give me information about where people are and where I can provide some education to debunk myths, where I can validate those experiences, because there's some very real reasons why Black people don't want to be on medication. I mean, it's very, very real. And we have to validate that and that history. And, and yes, children, Black boys are overdiagnosed and over-medicated. We want them, sometimes we medicate them and they, so they can sit down and be quiet and not move around. Wait a minute, they're boys. They need to move around and deserve to. So I find that when I do that, the result is much better, because I think people feel heard, they feel validated, and then we're able to have a good training, and then those connections are made where people can see their role in saving lives, their role in caring for themselves and others.
you all are essentially acting as a bridge, as a liaison to break through the mistrust that is there, frankly, for a lot of good reasons, to show that there are actually ways to care for your mental health, both within the family, in the community, but also by accessing mental health professionals.
But Christine, the way you frame that too, I think is important. What is an appetite for? Because there's, I think that's part of the challenge, that there's a difference between being hungry and then what you have an appetite for. And I think part of the challenge right now for how mental health services are delivered is that they're not delivered in a way that speaks to the appetite of the African American community. Mm-hmm. I can be hungry, and if you invite me to dinner, if all you're serving is okra, I don't have an appetite for okra. So I'm not going to eat the okra. I'm not coming back. I'm going to go where I feel like I can get something that speaks to my appetite. And I think that's what happens a lot, is that what's being served in terms of treatment and where it's being served doesn't fit the appetite of the African American community. So they go, that's why African Americans are much more likely to go to their pastors than they are to go to a psychiatrist, because it's what's being served is not being served in a way that's appetizing to us. And I think that's where a lot of the work has to be done.
And I was going
to say, when you look at the research as well, we have all of these interventions, but they haven't been validated on people of color. So we don't even know if they work in our communities that we are trying to serve. And I would like to also mention Sherry Mullock's work. She's done some work in the church, and her project is called the Haven Project. And it's got great great outcomes. And it's really about this peer-to-peer education model, which I think works way better, to be quite honest. Like you said, Vic, they're going to go to their pastor, they're going to talk to them. And if you can educate the pastor and the staff members and the other clergymen that are in that church about what those signs are, what those symptoms are, what to look for, they can be that first line of defense.
Absolutely.
And really, really take it seriously and want to take it seriously. I know at our church they do. I've approached my youth pastor and asked him if he would be interested in doing suicide research or prevention. And he was like, yes, absolutely, please, please. So there is absolutely an appetite, but we have to do it in the right manner. Like you said, we can't just feed them okra, right?
Well,
Okay, the take home is no more okra.
no okra.
No more okra.
Okay, now we're of course we're getting close on time, and I want to get to some of the amazing comments and questions that are coming forward. But I do want to give you, Ariel, a moment to just talk about your research, because I think it's so important. You are on the cutting edge of how we even look into the risks for young children, for youth, when their parents have a mental illness. And I know you've looked at even when their parents have been suicidal or who have attempted, and those racial findings. So if you could just speak to that a little bit, that would be, I think, really instructive for people to understand research.
Yeah, sure. So I will try to do as quick as possible so we can have more time for questions. But back in 2015, my colleague and I, Jeffrey Bridge, decided to look at the suicide rates of young children, because a lot of what you have seen within the research is really focused in on adolescents and adults. And we just don't know a lot about young kids under the age of 12 years old. So what we found is that when you look at the rate over time, we didn't find any differences. We didn't find an increase or decrease, but when you actually stratified, so when you looked at groups by race, we found that Blacks actually had an increase in their suicide rate, and that was compared to their white counterparts. So as you can probably imagine, we wanted to see, okay, well, what's going on when you look at sex? So is it in the males? Is it in the females? And what we found is it was actually the Black males. So Black males were actually dying more by suicide than their white male counterpart. And this was between 5 and 11 years old. And then we decided to do some more investigation looking at precipitating circumstances. And what that all means is just what are the things that were happening before the death of a child. And we looked at kids 5 to 11 years old again, compared to early adolescence. And we wanted to see, okay, were there any differences in those risk factors of kids that had died by suicide versus those that did not? Well, excuse me, those that were older. And what we found is that for the young children, they were more likely to be Black, more likely to be male. So again, confirming what we found earlier, but also they had more problems with family members and friends. Whereas with the 12 to 14-year-olds, they had more boyfriend-girlfriend problems. They were more likely to be diagnosed with depression or dysthymia if they had a diagnosis. And then also the younger children were actually more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD or ADD, which is attention deficit hyperactive disorder, for those that do not know. So again, that's different. That's not something that we normally have been associating with suicidal behavior in the past, that specific diagnosis. And again, as Tandra spoke, unfortunately, our Black youth are being diagnosed with that more frequently than other youth. So that is another concern that we are facing as well. And then finally, with my own research that I'm conducting right now, I'm looking at kids 6 to 9 years old that have a parental history of suicidal behavior. Unfortunately, we know that kids that have a parental history, they're more likely to actually attempt themselves, about 4 to 6 times more likely to do so. And then also they're more likely to do so at a younger age. So the average age for kids to unfortunately engage in suicidal behavior is around about 12, 13 years old. Whereas for these kiddos, they could start as young as 9. So we're trying to figure out, are there specific factors early on in these kiddos' lives, but also in their own personalities that they're expressing that can actually be targets for intervention because we know they're already at a high risk for suicidal behavior. So that's really what I'm focusing in on right now. And what we're finding, unfortunately, is that these kiddos with a parental history, they're more likely to have emotional regulation problems. So they have this inability to actually soothe themselves. And they are more likely to also have some concerns with medication as well. So they are more likely to be, they're more likely to be using medication versus those that aren't having suicidal ideation as well. So
Well,
doing right now.
yeah, no, this is so that your work is so rich, and I wanted people to just get a glimpse of this to understand what can be done. We have to understand what the risk factors are in order to come up with effective and culturally appropriate interventions. And so there's hope for our future. And you know, I just that little window you just gave us into your work makes me realize we probably need to have a dedicated session just to do a deeper dive to sort of digest that and really kind of let people grapple with those learnings. We have a program called the Research Connections program at AFSP that chapters can host. And anyway, you're giving me lots of neat ideas about something what we might do on your work and the others who are doing work in this really important area. But let me now turn my attention to our wonderful viewers who have been actively posting. Thank you so much. We have a lot of love and gratitude coming in. Thank you so much, Leah Raquetto and Matt Magana, Patrice Sullivan and Amy Grosso, who are just all singing your praises and really resonating with what you all are saying. Patrice says, so powerful in this moment, I feel seen, heard, understood. So thank you. Okay, now there are some important questions in here, and let me try to get to at least a couple of them. Well, this could be for all of us, but maybe I'll start with you, Ariel. Frankie Pickett is asking, were there issues of abuse, neglect, or bullying that were found in these younger age groups who are having suicidal behavior?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Frankie, for that question. So with my own research, I'm actually looking at parental history of abuse and neglect. And what we're finding is that, unfortunately, the parents do have a higher likelihood of experience sexual and physical abuse in their lifetime. We are beginning to collect that information on the kids right now. But with the research, what's been shown is that with the familial transmission of suicidal behavior, which is a fancy way of saying the way that from a parent to child, how suicidal behavior could be transmitting, is that some of the research indicates that sexual abuse plays a really big role in that transmission. So my work is actually going to be looking at abuse of the young children and trying to figure out, is that also replicating what we've seen in the older youth that this research has been conducted in.
Thank you for that. And I do want to also just highlight a point here that that when we talk about familial transmission, that can be both through some genetic underpinnings as well as from environmental and current dynamic issues in the family environment. But the main point is that suicidal behavior and suicide is never destined by your family history, that there are powerful protective resources and interventions. And we know from the ACEs study, for example, that even the presence of one caring adult in children's lives who have sustained enormous and numerous losses and trauma, that it protects them from mental health and suicide related and addiction and legal system outcomes later. So for our viewers, if you have any role as a parent, as an educator, as a youth worker in your community in any way, there's a role for you that you can't underestimate, that when you show up for somebody who's struggling, whether it's a peer or a youth for that matter, and you keep doing that on a consistent basis, that can be life-changing. You know, I'd love it if Tandra or Vic, if you have any experiences with that, and having not grown up in the Black community myself, does that translate? Is that true in your experience as well?
Absolutely. And I know we're being cognizant of time, so I'm glad that you pulled that out, Christine, about the importance of the connection. And that is really that positive mentoring relationship, that really is a protective factor. And I've seen it, I've been it, right? I've been that person, and I've seen it. And that's where, you know, having, you know, even beyond having a real convo, and real convo is about connecting. It's important for us to have these conversations. And when people feel like they matter and have a sense of belongingness, right? Feel like they fit in whatever social setting that they're in, whether they're in school or in a church or in the community, that they feel like they fit in, that can be so powerful. And so those individual relationships are critical. That mentoring is very important. And I've seen it and witnessed and experienced it myself. So yes, that's very true.
And I think too, when you talk, Christine, about the ACEs study and the importance of having a caring adult, I think that also speaks to why it is so important that we do a better job of recognizing signs of trauma, so that we can intervene in those situations, teaching our, you know, our teachers in the school system, teaching folks in the community to recognize the signs of trauma, because you could be that caring adult that steps in and changes that trajectory for a child. So that's one of the things I think that we also need to do a much better job at, is recognizing the signs of trauma.
Yes, and as you all so well know, guess what trauma can look like? It can look like somebody who's acting out, who is getting in trouble, who's belligerent. Those externalizing behaviors can be signs of internal suffering and distress and trauma as well. So that trauma-informed approach, not only in health systems, but in schools, can be just profoundly a game changer for all involved, actually, because then you're treating individuals as human beings with the background that they have and caring for them. I have one more important question that Dustin Morris is raising about how many people of color and Indigenous people, I happen to know Dustin works in Alaska, can be very fearful of calling 911 during a crisis. And how do we best acknowledge that? How do we help people then actually link up with resources when it may not be within their wherewithal to use the emergency services that are in place? And Vic, I've heard you talk about, in a conversation we've had recently, that using law enforcement to respond to any mental health crisis doesn't really make sense when you think about how it was built in the first place.
Right. Yeah, and I think you know that there's a lot of conversation now about switching to a 988 number. I think that's one of the things that we need to be focusing on. That calling 911 and having law enforcement show up is not going to be the best answer, because even with CIT training, law enforcement is still not the best trained to show up when someone's having a mental health crisis. And then also understanding, particularly as we look at what's going on around the country right now, people can see law enforcement go into fight or flight reaction naturally, and even more so when you're in the midst of a mental health crisis. So I do think that we need to rethink how we're connecting people to resources. And there are a lot of law enforcement organizations now that are embedding mental health professionals in their law enforcement agencies, so that you can have a licensed social worker or a peer to go out with the police officer when they're responding to a mental health crisis. I think those kinds of things are helpful, but I think so much of what we do need to be focusing on when we talk about police reform, I think part of what we need to be talking about is, you know, how do we build more of a mental health component into our community resources that can respond to people in mental health crisis.
Yes, I wanted to say that mobile crisis should become available in every state, in every community, and that 988 number that is going to happen, probably be ready for prime time in 2022, but is getting approved right now by the federal members. That even if they call 988 and we haven't built up those other clinical resources to be able to respond, it's still going to link up with the law enforcement system. But Tandra, I interrupted you.
Yeah, that's okay. I just want to add another component of that, of this discussion. You know, in recent weeks, and Vic and Ariel probably have experienced this as well, but, you know, because of relationships, people will often reach out to us when they are in crisis. You know, we may get a phone call from someone who has a friend or, you know, someone that they know who's experiencing a crisis. And that has been intensified for me in my experience the last couple of weeks. And so showing up for people, right, can also help during this time when people are legitimately afraid of calling 911 and what that represents in certain communities. But that trust, having someone that they trust, someone who can show up, who can validate their experience, not make them feel bad for the way they feel, acknowledge their fear, but then can be a voice and an advocate for them during this time of crisis when they can't do it for themselves. And literally that is getting hands dirty and reaching out on behalf of that person to call law enforcement if there's an immediate crisis, you know, if they're in immediate danger, staying on the phone with them, you know, making sure that you're communicating. We've done these things, right? That can also mean going to the emergency room with them when possible, or it can mean, okay, assessing the situation for those who can do that and saying, well, we don't need to go to the emergency room, but let me call this counselor, let me call this clinic. I know someone there. And based on your relationship with that person, that trust means a whole lot. And so we naturally do a lot of that, I think, in the Black community. And I've seen an increase in those types of outreach. So again, going back to what everybody can do and showing up and having those connections in that relationship with people and knowing what to say and what to do during those times. And you don't have to be a mental health professional to be able to help someone get the help they need.
I would add too, I'm a big fan of psychiatric advance directives. I think that's something that we need to build into the work too, so that people have something, a legal document that says, when I go into crisis, this is what I want to have happen.
Absolutely. It's a growing and really important mechanism that every health system and every person should know about, just like a regular advance directive. Well, this is so sad to say, but our time is already coming to a close, and feels like we could keep going on for another hour. I just want to thank each of you so much. You are so busy and doing the work that you're doing at all different levels, research, clinical, leadership, and health systems in your community. And yet you serve your community in this way as well, by putting yourself out there to just share your stories, your words of wisdom. And you also contribute to AFSP's work enormously. And I thank you for that. And for again, putting yourself out there for this particular town hall. Before we close, I'd love to just let you have last thoughts. If there was anything that we didn't get to, why don't we do that now? And if you don't, that's okay too. Ariel, why don't we start with you?
I was going to say that telling someone that they are loved goes a really, really long way. Those 3 words mean a lot to people, and you don't have to go into any more detail. Like I just did that today. I text messaged somebody. I was like, just so you know, you're loved. And they were like, you know, I really needed that. And that was it. Like it wasn't even, it didn't go any further. It's just a reminder that, again, you're heard, you're loved, and I'm here if you need me. So just doing those couple of things really goes a really long way. So I would encourage everyone to do that today. Just text someone, just say, you're loved.
100%, love it. Tandra, we'll go with you next.
You know, it's funny. I thought the same thing that you
It's
thought.
that McNair thing.
I know. It's like, hey, and I'm from Ohio. So there's
okay, here we go.
Here we go. I know, Vic. I'm sorry. But I do think that it's really important to let people know that you care. and, you know, let them know that, you know, say to them, you're not alone. I see you. I hear you. You matter to me. You don't have to have the answers. You're not going to solve their problems, but people just want to be heard and seen and validated. And so just piggybacking on that, I think that that's really important. It's always been important, but it's especially important right now. And I would encourage, you know, everybody listening to reach out to someone. And just because we are physically distancing, right, doesn't mean that we have to be socially distancing. We wouldn't be able to, we wouldn't even be doing this type of event, right, if it wasn't for the physical distancing that we're in. So we're reaching a wider audience, and we can still do that. So reach out to others and let them know that they are not alone.
I love it. Okay, Vic,
Yeah,
closing.
and I would echo what both of them said. You matter, your life matters. I would also put in a plug for peer-led organizations, clubhouse models, lived experience. I think those kinds of services are so important, and we need to put more resources into those kinds of services. And no more okra.
All right.
I really don't like okra.
Love fried okra.
No, no.
I'm an okra fan. Me too. I love it.
You can have mine.
It has
All
to
right,
be
well-
fried though. Only fried.
No, thank you.
On the note of okra, we will thank our participants so much, and really hope that you have gained a sense of community and healing and a safe space where we can come together even during these highly stressful, multi-layered, challenging times, no matter who you are, what your training is, and what your racial background is. We must come together. This is going to take all of us. So again, a huge thank you to our panelists, and we will end there for this time. We have a second town hall in our series that will be happening on July 9th, which I would invite everyone to at 3 p.m. Eastern. So hopefully we'll see you then.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye. Thank you so, so much. Rich dialogue.